This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 402. UK Labour's half-baked nationalisation plans.
What we need now is a laser focus under Labour's plan on passengers, on the people using the trains, and to bring the franchises back into public ownership with Great British Railways, so we can have a coordinated approach which will allow for better services, for more reliable services, and fares that people can actually rely on as they go forward. So that's the plan. It will take time because the franchises come in over a period of time, but we can get going on this straight away.
This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
So, nationalised railways in Britain, is that a bold move? Keir Starmer there promising something that would bring the UK into line with, well, Canada, France, Australia, Germany, Italy, Spain, Japan, just about everywhere else. And why stop there? Why not nationalise water, given the UK is the only place in the world where water and sewage are fully privatised, and energy? You know, maybe Jeremy Corbyn's socialist plans weren't so extreme after all. So how far down the road do we go with nationalisation? And with climate change, have we actually got any choice? That's this week on the Debunking Economics Podcast. So Keir Starmer and Labour in the UK has announced that if they win the next election, which after the local elections recently sounds more and more likely, then they will nationalise the railways. But the question is, why stop there? What about water and other public monopolies? What about energy? So, Steve, nationalising the railways, I mean, we need to move from the very complex arrangements that we have between the various carriers at the moment, all that intricate, mechanics of dealing with trains passing from one area to another and the complex ticketing and payment and repayment between various providers, which is just a nonsense. And then the need for expensive regulation as well. But if we got rid of all of that and it was all came into public hands, does it necessarily guarantee better or cheaper services?
Well, I mean, the funniest thing, the reason you don't even need to do any logic about this, you just change countries. And you hop in virtually any country in Europe, and then even the overall international system within. And
it's better.
Far better.
But,
I mean,
that's always been the case. Even when we had a nationalised British rail, it was better. And I don't know whether that's the. Is part of it legacy because we built the railways so much sooner in the UK?
That's a large part of it. That's a lot. I mean, because when you look at the original construction of railways, most of them were private ventures. Railways were the electric vehicles of the 19th century, and they were the automobile of the 19th century, and everybody was trying to get in on the act and make money out of it. And what you had was a whole stream of railways, booms and busts. Whether it be, I don't know whether there were competing systems of putting two railways between the same two towns.
There were absolutely there were slightly different routes, and then to try and it really was how quickly can we build, and then also let's build to this town, but where will people stay when they get to this town? Oh, we better build some hotels as well, so we'll diversify into hotel building. I mean, it really was the birth of domestic tourism in the UK that these companies were overseeing.
Yeah, and it's booms and busts come out of that, and you then what you had was rather than a well planned way of linking major cities together. You had, not just a spider web, but multiple spider webs thrown across the tapestry of the UK, and then that was then nationalised at the end of all that, what gave us a system that occurred again before privatisation. So it's been if we actually have nationalisation taking on an outlook, you'll have privatised system, nationalised, privatised, nationalised. So it'll be 4 times through the ringer on this.
Yeah, but the reason it was nationalised the first time around was because we were starting to see demand falling away, and there were so many of those duplicate lines, and we had the whole Beeching report, which sort of rationalised all of those lines at the same time. I mean, we don't want to do that now because there's there'll be no lines left. So that was part of the reason behind it. Now it's sort of like saying, well, okay, we think we can do it better. And my question mark is, well, other than all that complex ticketing, etc., Will we do it any better in private hands? What makes us think that a group of civil servants...
in public hands?
In public hands, sorry, yeah. What makes us think that a group of civil servants are going to do a better job than the commercially run organisations?
This is one of the sort of what's the function of railways in the modern generation? We go back to the 19th century. It was sort of thing which could have been government funded in the same way that the original attempts to get into space were government funded, but it wasn't. It was done by private groups competing with each other, and then you got this huge. You had the booms and busts that railways caused in the 19th century, and then this confused mess of different railway lines. Then what ultimately happens? Railways are no longer leading edges of innovation. That's in the actual thing that you're having. Devices that run on metal rails. Let's get a very basic definition of what a railway means in this instance. And that's no longer cutting-edge technology. We've got high-speed rail and things like that aren't being done. But you're well past the point where that's the centre of innovation. And then that sort of area is one where you can say, well, it's a public service. We want people to get from one point to another. We want those costs to be as low as possible. We don't want it to be something where you impose a profit centre requirement on people to go from one town to another or to move within their own town, like moving around London. And what you have, if you try to make everything privately profit-based, when you're really talking mass transit for people who are, generally speaking, it's the poorer end of the society, not the rich end, you're simply bumping up the cost of living for them, which is going to reduce their capacity to work in those private institutions that they're going from home to the factory to work in the first place.
But,
so that's the sort of...
okay, so I mean, a couple of things there. One is you're saying, well, there's no innovation. So we're just saying this is almost like the end of the line for railways, in that, we're just going to carry on doing what they're doing now for those people who can't afford to travel in by any other means, or, is that, I mean,
it comes down to what's the investment horizon. And this is what I saw particularly, being somebody who's lived both in the European mainland and the UK. And I think this is where a subscriber of ours and a good friend, Avner Offer, has done a very nice little book, which we better mention in the summary, where he tries to make the public-private divide and say what should be the dividing line between something being publicly funded and privately funded. And it comes down to the length of time you're going to get a full return on your investment. And if you have things which, like sewerage, which I think is the obvious example to use for other areas to bring back into public ownership, health, everything where the return is so long that your short-term oriented private sector manager, capitalist, is going to not bother doing that, because by the time that particular investment makes a return, he or she has moved on and somebody else has taken over the management role. And therefore you get a lack of investment in the long-term stuff, which is the thing you want the state to be providing. It's not possible to make a return on that stuff anyway from the private sector. Therefore, you don't do the investment and the thing degrades over time.
Well, here's the crazy thing. It makes perfect sense. But here's the crazy thing on that, in that, if you're running a train company, you have the license currently for a certain number of years. I don't know what it is, but it's not a very long time. So you've got to make short-term gain out of it, just in case you lose the franchise. And so they don't invest in the trains, the rolling stock themselves. They go to what are called Roscoes, which are rolling stock companies. So companies like Eversholt and Porterbrook and Angel Trains. And they lease the trains from them. And looking at some figures from the FT, they spent $3.1 billion in the year up to March 2023. That's 26% of their overall expenditure, leasing these trains. So, and these are owned by overseas investors like Allianz, Canada's Public Sector Pension Board, CK Hutchison in Hong Kong. So private companies are operating, clipping the ticket, literally making money, and their investment is not huge because they are just leasing the rolling stock. The railways are currently owned. The actual infrastructure itself is currently owned by the government. It was privatised, and then they had a few accidents. And they thought, we'll better bring that back into public hands. So these companies are not doing a great deal. And when they nationalise them, they're not going to nationalise. I mean, they're not. These rolling stock companies will still exist, and I bet you the government continues to lease from the rolling stock companies, and yet that's the
bloody hell. That's the crazy. That's the crazy bit. I mean, again, the contrast in the quality of the rolling stock between Europe and the UK is so extreme; it's virtually laughable. A large number of railways carriages in Europe will have built-in Wi-Fi. There's yet some Wi-Fi. That's a fairly trivial example.
But having in the UK just doesn't work. That's all.
Yeah. Or it works at the railway station, not when you move for 50 metres down the line. That might be a
reflection of the cellular network rather than the railways.
That's another thing to knock about the UK. But yeah, I mean, my favourite experience of that was I was told when I first arrived that there was some UK line where the carriages had the handle on the outside of the carriage, and you had to open the window and put your hand through to reach.
That's where it always used to be. Yeah.
And I couldn't believe it. That's still running. I mean,
no, it isn't still running. In fact, there was
They must shut it down the last few years, have they? Because I thought it.
There's a case in Scotland where there's an old railway line that is an old steam line that's running trains where the and I think it's a not-for-profit, and they're having to close it down. It's a very small private company anyway. They're having to close it down, and there's a campaign, and the reason is because they've been told they've got to have automatic locking doors, and they're saying we just can't afford to do that. So it's so there's a case in point where, and so actually for a lot of people that go actually for the charm of going on this old train through the hills of Scotland, for it to be modernised by regulation. So you can argue both ways, but always used to be the way. You had to roll down the window and stick your hand outside to open the rather unwieldy doors.
I think this is another one. Actually, I wasn't in Scotland when I caught this train. It was somewhere in the UK as well, England as well. So it's but the lack of investment in the rolling stock is quite a joke in the UK. The calibre of rolling stock in Europe is far, far higher. And one of my little fantasies has often been to bring back Maggie Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and pop them on trains in Europe and the UK, and then have them have to tick a box. Where do you think you are? And I think if they were in the rolling stock in the UK, they'd say, we're in Europe, this is obviously old-fashioned Soviet stuff. And if they were on the UK, this must be the modernised stuff brought in by our privatisation revolutions. It's the other way around. So the real problem, this is where Avner's work is such a useful contribution. The horizon over which you get returns to actually invest in that stuff is so low, is so long, that you don't bother doing the investment. Of course, it's made even worse because, as you say, they privatised the management of the rolling stock as well as privatising the delivery of tickets. So you've got a double whammy there, and nobody bothers doing any investment in it. And you've got, rather than the privatising leading to a revolution in quality, which is the Maggie Thatcher, Ronald Reagan belief, it's led to stagnation.
Yeah. So can you, and then water is the obvious other example. I mean, besides Britain, how many other countries have fully privatised their water and sewage system? It's a very round number, this one.
Zero?
Zero, yeah. We're the only country in the world that has done it fully. So there's public-private partnerships in various degrees in various parts of the world. But to holus bolus, the whole system being sold off, 70% of that ownership is owned by foreign investors. It's a nonsense because you can clearly, evidently see the consequences of that. And again, that gets down to the long-term investment, doesn't it? But the issue is, if Labour says, well, as nationalising the railways, we're also going to nationalise water, re-nationalise water. The issue they face, obviously, is that the amount of investment that is needed to get back to a level that is of suitable standard is huge, isn't it? And possibly politically unpalatable. I mean, we're, billions or hundreds of billions.
This again comes down to how does the state borrow to invest or not? Then that's where the accounting aspect of modern monetary theory that says that the government creates money when it spends, it doesn't need to borrow. That's the way you should look at it and say, is there a justified need to expand government money creation for the area of transport and water? And when you've got the situation of the privatised water systems in the UK right now, where one of the most dangerous things you can do in the UK is go for a swim in a river or on a beach. That is appalling. So it's a classic. That would be seen as a failure of public investment infrastructure, were it done by the public sector, but it's actually by the privates failing to do it for the same reason that Avner's book outlines, that the horizon on returns of the necessary investments to avoid having sewerage in your rivers is beyond that of as most private sector managers. So they don't do the investment, then the system breaks down and you're left with a catastrophic failure. That in that case, yes, definitely, you have to. It's worthwhile getting back to the stage where we can manage to swim in British rivers or drink the water out of them or use them for other purposes apart from sewerage lines.
Yeah,
it's worth that investment.
So we could get back to the good old days when people died from hypothermia rather than poisoning from swimming in the water in Britain. So
that's right. Yeah.
But the investment. So you're saying, well, okay, yeah, follow the modern monetary theory road, and it's all public investment. The issue becomes resources, doesn't it? The resources in this case would be people. The amount of work that we needed to be done for all of these industries would be fairly people intensive, and we got close to full employment, we'd have an issue trying to fill all those jobs.
That's one of the bottlenecks. And the other one is if you're going to go to the stage where you have decent infrastructure, then that's a fair amount of capital investment as well. And the thing which the UK has, it's just degraded its calibre of its physical infrastructure for supporting industry dramatically over the last 40 years, with the belief that the growth was going to be in services rather than manufacturing. So you've lost the skill base, and America to some degree has done the same thing. You don't have the trained workforce. You don't have the machines that make the machines that you would have if you were still following what was supposed to be old-fashioned Keynesian ideas back in the 50s and 60s. You would have the machinery. You'd have the capacity to do the industrial development you need to do what should have been done by the private companies with proper sewerage treatments and so on. So it really is a case, if you try to save money, you end up destroying resources, not just the physical stuff, but the capacity to recreate that machinery is gone. So you can't really catch up on
but
the 30
years. But you just need to buy the machine-making machine. I mean, well, you buy the machine-making machine so that you can make the machines. Things are reversible, aren't they? And
they take a engineering talent to do that. And if we don't have the knowledge base, that's another classic instance where if you go, like Australia's another example there with the ferries in Sydney, where the decision was made not to manufacture ferries for the river and harbour transport in Sydney, but to outsource them, I think, to an Indonesian company. And that resulted in, and therefore we didn't have the local ferry building, shipbuilding capabilities in Australia. They basically were let decay and handed over to an Indonesian company. And what comes back? A catamaran that's too high for the bridges on the river it's supposed to traverse. So you've got a top deck where people are advised not to go up there because you'll be decapitated by the bridge we're about to go under. So it is a classic short-sightedness to believe everything is better done by the private sector.
Well, I mean, there were towns in the UK like Crewe and Derby, which were big towns that basically built from building trains, and they don't do any of that anymore now. So, but if you look at the new Elizabeth line in London, central London,
which is a good line, yeah.
I mean, it's an amazing engineering feat as well, in that it's been built, weaving its way in amongst an already complex web of tunnels, not just the underground, but sewage tunnels and all sorts of other tunnels that exist in London, plus Roman remains and goodness knows what else that you're not allowed to touch, and then also building these massive stations in amongst existing buildings in Oxford Street and Bond Street and the like. I mean, that was a huge engineering feat. I mean, massively over budget and a year or two late, but I mean, it shows that Britain can pull its finger out and deliver quite a big engineering achievement. Just takes time and a lot of money to do it.
Yeah, and time and money which can be created by the government, and time which the government has. And those are the factors that were completely missed in thinking about the shift to privatising in the first instance. I'm actually as well as being a great way to travel, it's a great way for people who don't live in the country all that often to see what has happened courtesy of the last 40 years of privatising everything.
Yeah. And that makes the HS2 even more sad in a way, doesn't it? Because, and here you've got a situation where, major investment in a major infrastructure project. I guess it's easy to pull the plug on something like that because you say, oh, it's getting very expensive, and I need that to fill in potholes, which is basically Rishi Sunak's short-term outlook, because he can't see very far. Well, if he stood on a box, maybe he'd see a bit further.
Please.
But I mean, the problem is when you're looking at doing cost-benefit analysis of stuff like that, you don't look at the longer term indirect benefits, do you? So we've talked about the need for growing the economic complexity of a country, and to do that you need to be able to. So basically, the more industries you've got that work together, and the better the economy and the opportunity for growth is that much greater. And to do that, you've got to be able to move around the country nimbly. And HS2 would have been a great opportunity to do that if it'd been done in the right way, so that people in the north could easily deal with people in the south, and they could, in a couple of hours, they could, be in London talking to somebody, and somebody in London could be up in Leeds talking to somebody. And if you've got the capacity up, because these trains are travelling regularly at a high speed without any slow trains to stop that happening, then you can get the capacity up, you can get the prices down. But all of that just thrown away. I mean, it's like a massive opportunity for the UK just ditched because the numbers didn't stack up supposedly, and that's because of this short-term cost-benefit focus rather than looking at your whole idea about systems thinking, isn't it? Everything's connected.
And if you don't look at the time horizons involved in different systems, you see everything with the private sector, then those elements of the take a long time horizon, don't get built, and then suddenly, and this is the case certainly with the sewerage situation in the UK, then all the other stuff which depends upon those elements of an interlinked system breaking, the whole thing falls apart. So you end up drastically undermining your long-term future by thinking the private sector is better at everything.
Yeah. And yet, there's some people would say, well, you can commercially run monopolies if you insist on minimum requirements, and those requirements are for social purposes. So, for example...
regulation, that'll work
and in some ways, and sometimes it does, doesn't it? So for phone companies, I'm a bit of a mixed attitude on phone companies. So long as you say, well, okay, you've got to provide low-cost line rental for those people who can't afford mobile phones. So that's old-fashioned thinking now. So you need a low-cost mobile plan for people who can't afford, because everyone should have the right to be connected. Rail companies, perhaps you could say, well, you've got to offer cheap fares at certain times of the day. You've got to have there's got to be a minimum fare. If you feel like you can make money out of business travellers at peak time, then go for it. But for the social good, certain times of the day, you've got to offer a much cheaper. And then power companies, which obviously have responded to the fact that people are getting a subsidy based on usage, have just jacked up the fixed charge, the fixed daily charge, because they can. So actually saying, well, actually you've got to come up with a system where prices, where you don't penalise low users with a high fixed charge. In fact, let's get rid of the fixed charge. Let's just have usage charges, and you have to make those usage charges progressively more expensive the more you use, to try and disincentivise heavy users. So you're sort of like saying, well, okay, you can run as a private concern, but you've got to follow public policy on this. And the public policy is that you should be encouraging people to use less.
Yeah, I mean, often what you get out of a lot of this stuff is just supposedly the argument that the private sector will do things better. That's the bottom line assumption, which itself can be false when your investment horizon time length is a significant issue. But the other thing is, it assumes that the private sector is lean and mean. Well, it's normally lean and mean to its actual core workers, not lean and mean to its actual management on top. And what you then get marketing expenses. One group, when you have the capacity to compete over the same potential pool of customers, and this is clearly the case with the university sector, for example, you get a proliferation of marketing costs and management costs coming out of that, which actually can be more expensive than if there was a single public entity involved. Certainly that's the case for health insurance. So there's so many areas where this, rather than being more efficient, you get more waste out of the private sector because it's focusing upon demand, trying to grab that that demand, and the costs of getting the demand, rather than providing a basic level of service, which is what the state tends to do, the costs of that become overwhelming, and that's the
so marketing. I take your point on marketing budget. So if you only had the government supplying a service, we wouldn't be saying, "Hey, use more electricity." But if you've got several electricity companies, they're all going to be competing against each other. Look, when we come back, energy is an interesting one. I feel like there's no choice if we're going to reach net zero. You can't do that with energy in private hands. And I've got a very simple argument about why that might be, which came out of a coffee conversation with a mate of mine this week. So back in a second to talk about that. This is the Debunking Economics Podcast.
This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
So we are looking this week as to whether you should nationalise companies. Obviously, Labour in the UK has said they want to nationalise the railways, which would be nice. I wonder whether actually they've picked the wrong target, because there's obviously everyone who's going, well, what about water companies, given that they are paying themselves huge salaries and they're polluting our water. But also energy is the obvious one as well, because if you nationalise energy, I mean, the focus from the government has been, trying to fix the short-term problem of rising prices. And that has been because we've had rising demand for energy. We've had falling supplies on a global price basis. So prices have gone up. The government then introduced price caps, and this has happened around the world. They've offered subsidies as well. I mean, that wouldn't actually be any different, that situation, if the government owned the energy company. We'd still have that, supply-demand imbalance, which would be pushing prices up. That wouldn't fix that particular issue.
No, but one thing that you mentioned earlier would fix, and that's the energy companies are trying to get us to use more energy, and that, in a private sector environment, that is what's going to happen, and not necessarily something you want to reject. But when it comes to energy now, we should know that we've got to drastically reduce our energy consumption. We need far less consumption of energy to reduce the damage we're doing to the biosphere. And that is very hard. That just goes entirely against the grain of a private sector enterprise. We're saying, please consume less of what we sell. So you do need the nationalisation of the energy grid and the nationalisation of anything where people are going to end up encouraging us to use fossil fuels, which is the bottom line here. What's actually happened instead, of course, is the reverse. The private or the state, particularly the national governments, which are themselves oil promoters, the Saudis and co, and then the remaining private oil companies have taken over the United Nations process, as we saw at COP28. So, the private interest is in the case of energy, is what's got us into this dilemma in the first place in many ways. And reverse it, you've got to say that's got to be state-owned, and we want to reduce usage, not increase.
Well, the energy companies would say, well, you know what, we are increasingly using renewable energy. And so,
well, they'd say that. They would say that, wouldn't they?
They would. But I mean, at the end of the day, they still want to sell energy, even if everything they sold was a renewable energy. They still want to pipe it across the country and make money off you for it. So my next door neighbour has got solar cells on his roof, and he's got a Tesla battery or two fixed to his wall as well. And he's got one of these apps, like I have for my electric car, where you can see what's going into the house. He can see what's going from his solar cell, what's going into his battery, and what's being, so what's being used in the house at that time, coming from the grid, and what's coming from his battery, and how much is being added, and all that sort of stuff. And lots of graphs. I mean, he loves it because he's a numbers guy. So he loves, trying to get the number down to zero or even negative. And he says, the investment is worth it. Apart from the fact, he loves gadgets. So even if he wasn't making any money, I think he'd still do it. But, it's worth it because even though the payback's quite slow, it does pay for itself in the end. And he's saying to me, because I get a much cheaper rate for using energy to charge up my car at night, like 7 pence per kilowatt hour rather than 30 pence per kilowatt hour, which is what I get charged during the day. And I could do the same if I got a battery, even without solar cells, because not a lot of room on our roof. But if I got a battery, I could do the same thing. I could charge up the battery overnight at 7 pence per kilowatt hour. But the issue is, if everybody did that, the energy company would not be charging 7 pence per kilowatt hour, would they? Because they'd be losing a lot of money. They'd jack that up. So you know that it's one of those things that, so it's okay now, but the risk of making that investment personally is that you are reliant on a private company saying, trust us, we're not going to charge you much. And then when everybody does it, they're going to have to jack the prices up for them to make a profit. So you are not ahead in any way. By that very simple argument, you've got to put it in public hands so the government can say, yeah, sure. We'll make less money because you're using less energy. Brilliant, because that's what we're here for.
Yeah, you're trying to reducing energy consumption. So, and this is, I think we don't realise we're in this world yet, but we certainly are, where energy shortages are going to be ruling the roost of the entire behaviour of our society. And in that situation, you don't want it to be managed by people who are saying, we want to use more energy, which is the case when you've got private ownership of the energy distribution system and the energy generation system. The big issue I've got with that as well, which my engineer friends will tell me, I'm sure, in comments later, is the grid itself, and the grid's not built for feed-in production of energy. So we have, but that again is an area where if you're going to address that, then you would want the public institutions doing it rather than private, because you want them to achieve that for social reasons, not for profitability ones.
And the issue again is, isn't it, it's not joined up thinking. So, our whole approach to energy. So we do bits and pieces. So, we give incentives to consumers to do stuff like getting solar cells put on the roof, or getting heat pumps, or buying electric cars. We close down coal-fired power stations. All of that is good, but is it actually joined up thinking? It's all been coming from the Department of Energy and Climate Change, a couple of hundred civil servants. And their focus lately has been on trying to make energy more affordable because of the rising prices. End of story. All their focus has been on that. It's not systematic thinking that's going on here, is it, towards achieving net zero? It's a bit haphazard. So again, I'm wondering whether it's sort of like it can't be done by private companies, but is the government best placed to do this as well? Or is it something where we say, it's an awful word, but, we used to have quangos, we still do, but, quasi-government organisations where you have experts who look after this sort of thing, and they come out with a strategy and they're responsible for, implementing it.
Yeah, you're inheriting a complete mess, and that's partly the problem, because, again, the ideology of privatisation, which Maggie Thatcher and Ronald Reagan are deservedly most associated with, basically says there won't be any problems in the future. The private sector will solve all of them. You won't need welfare because everybody's going to have a high-paid job. You won't need you won't need health precision because we'll all be having much cheaper medicine anyway in the future. Yada yada yada. You get to the future and you were sold a total pup. What do? You've then got you can't get out of this without enormous cost of reversing a mistake. And that's the trouble. The lack of systemic thinking. The real driver behind all this was the Marshall's interlocking supply and demand curves, which even on its own grounds has been shown to be intellectually barren, but still believed by the economic priesthood. So we went down this route being promised nirvana. We've ended up in the form of purgatory, and getting out of purgatory isn't cheap.
Well, it's an argument you could make if there was only one product in the world and no interdependencies. If we all just bought one thing, and the supply and demand might work on that basis. But the joined up plan, though, so Labour has got a plan for Great British Energy, which is going to be a new publicly owned clean energy company. So they say, first of all, we're going to have a proper windfall tax on oil and gas companies. Then we're going to establish Great British Energy, which is going to give us, in their words, real energy independence from foreign dictators. It's going to be owned by British people, built by British people, to benefit the British people. I hope you're standing up while I'm reading this, while singing "God Save the King."
You're actually reading that. That's
what they say.
Document. Oh my God!
It's going to it's the Labour Party document. It's going to invest in clean energy across our country. For example, by making the UK a world leader in floating offshore wind. Now, that all sounds great, but I wonder whether actually it's just a bit of a half-assed approach. Because actually, what we need is to take that to the next step, surely, which is where the government is responsible for the buying in of all energy supplies for the UK. So imagine if Great British Energy was saying, yes, we'll tax heavily companies that are creating dirty fuel, but also we will invest or provide grants or some sort of system to help other companies to establish. It's got to be a bit of private investment here, but other companies to invest in green power generation. And we will choose who we buy from, trying to solve this, shortest possible cost. And but obviously we're going to invest in renewables, so we're going to drive all of this towards renewable energy. And the fact that we are buying it as a whole block for all of the UK means that we can go to we can go to OPEC and say, well, look, you can try and push all our prices up. If you push the price of oil up, all we're going to do is invest in more green energy for the UK. And then imagine if you took that one stage further and all of Europe behaved like that. So you started to have a powerful force where actually you are taking on, as they say, the dictators who are creating a lot of this dirty energy. It's the buying power, the government buying power, which we haven't quite got the hang of. And yet that's something you would have thought would be fairly easy to implement, which would result in cheaper energy and could drive investment in alternatives to fossil fuels.
Yeah, I mean, I'm beginning to regret my age, not because it's lousy to be over 70, but it's lousy to have historical memory going back 60 years. Of all these various promises of what was going to happen out of privatisation and the actual outcome. And then right back to the days when lousy prices being paid by they used to call them the Four Sisters, the big four privately owned oil companies, led to the formation of OPEC. And now what happened as a result of that was that I think the oil price was kept at $2.50 a barrel for the whole period, pretty much from 1945 to 1973, which was progressively less and less money going to the oil-producing nations who felt rightly exploited by the whole thing. And then that's when the Yom Kippur War occurred. Anybody who had backed Israel in that war was given limited access to oil from the countries who nationalised the oil, the oil companies that were mining their publicly owned resource of fossil fuel. And fast forward now, and we've now got OPEC as the dominant power player on the planet in terms of the cost of energy, and still trying to promote using fossil fuels, and we're trying to get away from the damn things. So again, that lack of systemic thinking has caught us in a systemic dilemma.
Right, but if we started to have buying groups which were as powerful as OPEC, then we'd play them in their own game. And when they say, well, we're going to push our prices up, we're in a position to be able to say, well, you can, but we're not going to buy it.
Yeah, but
if you keep on doing that, we are just going to invest faster in alternatives, so you'll hasten your own demise.
Well, I mean, again, we're not thinking systemic. We've obviously inevitably strayed into the issue of climate change here and what's driving it, which is energy consumption and getting the vast majority of energy from fossil fuels. And again, my dear friend, economists have been the main reason why we haven't paid attention to trying to get rid of the fossil fuels and move to other forms of energy which don't burn fossil fuels and don't put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So we're in a predicament. What we're trying to discuss here is how do you get out of a predicament, not how do you solve a problem. And certainly, I think where we're going in the future is you do not want to have something's going to happen with the climate. God knows what it will be. I've got about 5 different gambling points that people working in climate change are now talking about as what's going to get people to wake the F up. And when that happens, we've got to rapidly get back to what we should have been doing for the last 50 years, which is moving in the direction of less dependence upon fossil fuels. So,
but if we've got to drive for change, though, my point is, if Labour says, well, we're going to set up a whole new body, and it's only going to go part of the way to the solution, shouldn't we be pushing to them to say, no, think about this more? Because all you're talking about is just an investment company that's going to drive more renewables. That's fine. But actually, you need to monopolise the buying power so that you've got control over all the energy that is being consumed in the UK. And then you will need to set up partnerships with other European countries who face this problem as well, on the basis that, first of all, it will reduce prices, and secondly, it will reduce dependence on fossil fuels without having to wait for that catastrophe. It's just like taking, well, if you accept that you see change, that's why you're setting up this new agency. For God's sake, do it properly. Just don't go for an interim half-assed solution. Go the whole hog.
Yeah, well, I mean, half-assed has been the name of the last 50 years, and this comes down to believing leave it all to the market. The idea is that the government can't do long-term planning, shouldn't do long-term planning. The market, which is a diversified system, will do it better via the price system. That was the ideology. We're now in a mess compared to the situations we mentioned, rail and sewerage and so on, that the privatised nirvana has not arrived. We're in a private purgatory instead. So how do you get out of that? Well, in the case of the energy issue, you want to drastically, we're going to have energy rationing at some point. That is not the sort of thing a private sector does. So you are caught up on the point where you're going to be forced to put everything in public ownership. And then the question is, do you have the skills to do it properly? And those skills, again, have been lost over the last 50 years.
Yeah, which again, if you set up an agency, maybe the first thing they do is try and build up that skill set. But it's hard to argue that free market argument in the energy markets, isn't it? Given it's supplied by an oligopoly.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's anything but free market.
Yeah, well, again, with the vision of the market itself is a myth. Perfect competition and nonsense like that. Numerous suppliers, all of a small scale. All these scale issues that this completely ignores. The interlocking relationships in the private sector system. They're all the extent to which a whiteboard drawing of a couple of intersecting lines have dominated how we think about engineering is just quite tragic from my perspective.
So this is a point just to finish on, and maybe we don't answer it, maybe it's a podcast for another day, but just as we try and figure out how we deal with it in places like the UK, and it's obviously similar in all other developed nations, what about clean energy to developing nations? So the International Energy Authority or Agency, the IEA, reckons that to meet rising energy demands in ways that align with the Paris Agreement in developing nations, annual investment, whether it's public or private, in clean energy in these developing nations will need to go from about 770 billion per year, which is what they reckon was spent in 2022, to 2.8 trillion per year by the early 2030s. Now, who's a side, many-fold increase. Who's going to fund investment in renewable or clean energy in developing nations when, our investment in developing nations in the past has been largely investing in getting resources that we can suck out from underneath them? Where's the return for private investment in making the third world or developing nations greener? And, how do we, and that is, a big chunk of the world as well.
Yeah, and this is again why I've forgotten who I saw made this observation, but they said we're no longer trying to solve problems; we're trying to escape predicaments, and there is no easy answer to any of this. So like you might say, well, the third world should be investing in its own infrastructure, but you need the skill base to be able to do that. And as you say, we've been taking the minerals out of them at cheap prices. The cobalt mining issue is probably the most egregious example of that. Effectively slave and child labor to get an essential component for our smartphones out of developing nations, and with very little revenue going back to the nation itself, so it doesn't have the skill base. And so it's a whole series of predicaments, not problems which have easy solutions. And in that particular case, the only way you can think about it as being feasible is to enable localized energy production for localized energy consumption. And I know a few small level groups which are working on things like cheap solar, cheap for heat production, for the sort of heat you need for industrialized activities. That sort of thing, it'll help, but it's still a predicament. We have disabled our capacity to handle the major issues we now face. And we can't go back in time and reverse that mistake. That's largely what we need to do to make this a problem rather than a predicament.
Well, look, I guess the progress is, and let's hope he doesn't stuff it up, that Keir Starmer is at long last talking about privatising utilities. He's starting with railways. Nationalising, sorry. That's right. I grew up during the Thatcher years. Nationalising.
That's right.
Got so used to the idea. It's been implanted in my brain almost from birth. Yeah, so the idea of nationalising utilities, at least now, he's talking about that. Jeremy Corbyn talked about it, and he got hammered, didn't he? And now there's no problem at all. It's almost that everyone is going, yes, please, when, how quickly. The issue is, how can he do it in a way that isn't going to stuff it up and actually creates no benefit whatsoever, and in fact possibly even makes things worse. For that he's got to tread fairly carefully, I think.
That's just an issue of another podcast.
How do you do it? Yeah. All right, very good. We'll leave it there for now. Good to talk, Steve.
Okay, mate. Bye.
The Debunking Economics Podcast.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, then please share it with your friends, like it on YouTube, and subscribe to this channel.